by Harold Lamb. Continues chapter 8, right? Isas. And the plan of the Macedonian breakthrough. Okay, the Macedonian phalanx. The beasts, companion cavalries, the Thracian horse, the Agrarians, the Cretan archers, Thessalian horse, allied light troops, and against the enemy units. Okay? So, looking at that battle plan again. This, oh, I didn't show it right. This particular phalanx, however, did something unusual and barely noticed by the enemy. It edged forward on the right, advancing, as soldiers say, by Achaeon on the right. As it did so, a most unusual unit appeared on the side of it. The Hypaspists are aiders. They were on foot and heavily armed, but could fling themselves forward, some 3,000 strong, almost as rapidly as the horsemen. When these Hypaspists advanced, Thracian horsemen, I don't know the Greek spelling, is it Thracian or Thracian horsemen, farther out, or is it something even different, also moved ahead, beyond the Thracians. Screening them and supporting their movement were twin regiments of the Agrarianian Highlanders and the fine Cretan bowmen. Later these became Alexander's favorites. So the Macedonians carried out their plan of battle, with each unit supporting the other, while they drove something like a wedge out from their right, deep into the enemy lines. Then, down the center of that opening wedge came the heavy companion cavalry at full gallop, picking the opening between the Hypaspists and the Thracians, smashing through to the rear of the enemy. The companions were the best armed and mounted of all troops, and they numbered at this time about 2,000. Usually after the breakthrough, they swung inward towards the enemy center, but wherever they went, the Hypaspists and the experienced Thracian horse raced after them. At this point, the whole phalanx was apt to advance, and the battle would change to a pursuit. Such was the maneuver that had been started too soon at Cavranea, and had been checked in the river Granicus, yet had brought decisive victory to the Macedonian arms. Of all the contingents, only the Cretan bowmen served for hire, although the Greek allied units had not come along too willingly. There were auxiliary units, the talented engineers who also operated Diodes's siege train, the physicians and scientists on the march. Some barbarian horsemen, like the Thracians, served as teamsters, while the light-armed skirmishers doubled as body servants for the elite companions. The compact army of about 27,500 had almost no supernumeraries. Alexandros's Agemma, or personal guard, was made up of selected companies of companions. Hypaspists are phalanxmen in rotation. The staff then consisted of 7 brigade commanders, like Perdiccas, who stayed close to Alexandros until an engagement began, and when they went to their commands. This morning, as usual, Alexandros went with the attack forces towards the hills on the right, while Parmenio took the left flank, which he was to anchor against the sea. Okay, now I don't believe that, in the whole mercenary thing, that war should be fought in terms of justice, not making a salary. But the salaries should, by and large, mostly not go to the state, but go to the soldiers and their families, of course. Because not some soldiers aren't going to make it, but you know, Alexandros, who had probably not slept at all in the night, showed evidence of being very nervous, as he has reason to be. His first sight of the half-moon bay showed him masses of enemies awaiting him, as he had visualized only in dreams before. This was an army of nations, Greek mercenaries, Kurdish infantry, ranging on the far side of a large stream, with other forces spreading over the slope of the hills on his right, and a cloud of cavalry poised there, as if waiting for the Macedonians to advance. Behind this battle line, other masses of the Asiatics stretch back to the distant town of Issus. The shore of the bay was itself like an amphitheater, and not too large a one, with a narrow entrance gate through which he had come, and a corresponding gate, another narrow pass, at far end of the bay behind Issus. He must have seen how he was outnumbered in horsemen. His infantry could not retreat now. Within this natural arena there could be fought no delaying or holding action. Inevitably one army would be driven back against a narrow exit, much too small for its passage. Apparently the Asiatics had been following him down the coast road, and his rapid march back under cover of darkness had caught them on the shelving bay shore. Only along the shore itself, on his left, was the ground level enough for a massed cavalry charge. For an hour or so in the morning, he and Parmenio watched what was happening at the far end of the half-moon, keeping the Macedonians back, out of good observation, by the Persians. They observed the withdrawal of the cloud of cavalry from the hillside back over the stream, changing its ground to the lower shore. At the same time, the Persian center began to fortify the steep bank of the stream with wooden barriers. To counter the move of the Persian cavalry down to the shore, Alexandros, stop saying it like that, Xander, added to the Thracian horse from his own to Parmenio's command, cautioning them to keep out of sight as they moved. Then he added the Cretan bowmen, because at all cost Parmenio had to hold to the anchor of the Macedonian line there, on the level benches. If the Thracians and the Thessalians fought up to their belts in salt water, they had to hold the left flank. Then he advanced his battle line to attack as much as possible in the rolling ground. The horsemen were kept out of observation behind the infantry. When his men approached the stream, coming into full view of the masses on the other side, Alexandros rose among them at high tension on Bucephalus, reining in for a quick word with company commanders. The men cheered. They wanted to go on, but Alexandros kept the 4,000 Greek hoplites back of the phalanx as a reserve. On this narrow front, he did not want his Greeks to meet other Greeks, and he always watched the mountain flank. They were moving past the Asiatics, posted under the crest, and Alexandros must have studied the slopes, the rocky gullies, and the hollow of the stream ahead of him, for he sent the Agrionian mountaineers with his bowmen in support to clear the slopes above him. They did it by driving the light forces of the Persians up into the crest. With these slopes cleared temporarily, Alexandros had completed his observation of them. It was after midday, and he halted his advance to let men eat the rations they were carrying, while the dense Persian ranks were kept under arms. Foodless, he waited, but during this interval he was withdrawing the Agrians from the upper slopes, adding them to the Hypaspists at the right of the phalanx. He thought that the 2 or 3 troops of horse would hold the Persians up on the crests, and by now he was satisfied that the cavalry could move over the shoulders of the hills above him. Then he started the phalanx forward, an echelon to the right. These first regiments had to cross the stream at the foot of the hills, where the banks were steep. They got across and forged up the other bank. When they checked the companies of the Hypaspes ran in, drifting to the right. Behind them, at a foot pace, Alexandros started the companions moving. His spearhead of attack was now crossing the stream, tending uphill. The center regiments of the phalanx had been stopped at the barriers behind which the Greek mercenaries massed, but, always as ordered, they edged to the right, away from the shield side. What Alexandros had feared then had happened. Down on the shore, the strong Persian cavalry attacked, crossing the stream and driving into the much weaker Thessalian and Thracian horse. Still, the companions were held back, while the infantry gained ground yard by yard in front of them. The horsemen began to come under a heavy discharge of arrows and darts that set the horses surging. It was too dangerous to hold back any longer, and the companions were sent forward along the lane that had been cleared on the hillside. They broke through resistance there and swung sharply left, racing downhill. At full charge, they struck at the rear of the Persian phalanx, with the Hypaspists following after them. The close-packed Greeks and Persians, trying to reform, were driven back. At this point, one man gave up the battle before it was lost. Darius, the great king, Daravash, is that how you say his name? Darvash, in his chariot, behind the center of the Persian line, saw the companions breaking through. He ordered his chariot back. When it was checked by confusion along the road, he abandoned it and fled on a horse with his personal guards past Issus. It was luck that Darius should be a coward, but the deadly attack that frightened him had been anything but luck. What might have happened if he had kept his place in front of his strong reserves will never be known. What did happen as he raced away was that those reserves, backed up as far as the town, were thrown into a tangle of cross movements. Other units started back. The center phalanx, half enveloped now, began to give toward the shore. Now, obviously, one of the things about war that's very important is that the leaders of the countries should be the ones going to war. Not, oh, we want you people to go to war, and we'll sit back here and hope that you come back with money and stuff. There, the Asiatic cavalry had been having things all its own way, but it became aware of the panic behind it and swung around. It swept past the center, now in full retreat, and plunged through the infantry drawn up along the road. Alexandros had checked the companions' advance and waited until he was satisfied that Parmenio's forces were safe, even if battered. Then the companions took up the pursuit along the foothills, while all the Macedonian units pressed along the road. The fleeting Asiatics piled up in the narrow pass at the end of the bay, but Dilemma wrote in his journal afterward that the terrible congestion their horsemen suffered was as much as men fleeing on foot, and when the Macedonian cavalry reached the pass, they had to ride over the piled-up bodies of the dead. The pursuit continued until it was too dark to see what was underfoot, and the soldiers brought Alexandros the shield, mantle, and bow of the great king, which they had found in the abandoned chariot. At Issus, Alexandros had extracted the Macedonian army from an almost desperate situation. This had been accomplished by no inspired gamble, but by painstaking, relentless efforts. It had taken him until early afternoon to work up the column of companion cavalry, up to the vantage point of the hillside, where, incidentally, the Persian cavalry had held free tenancy early in the morning. It was an extraordinary feat to launch a charge of mounted men down this mountain slope like a landslide, but this was the only path possible for the maneuver of the heavy horse upon which the Macedonians relied, and Alexandros cleared in time, but only just in time. He had shown here that none of the nervous excitement of the Granicus. Midway through an engagement, he'd been able to check the advance of the striking arm. The companions backed, in this case, by the Hypaspists and the Agrianians, until he had made certain that the other flank had not been driven from the edge of the sea, but it was the relentless and rapid pursuit by the Macedonian forces that had broken up the Asiatic army of Issus. Nothing so terrifying had been encountered by armies of the East before, since they had met with nothing more speedy or destructive than small masses of Greek hoplites, such as I should know how to say Xenophon, but Xenophon. I think it's spelled a little different. 10,000. This army of Issus lost all its equipment and was scattered so widely that it never reassembled. Darius, who had lost his side arms, tents, family, and servants, gathered together no more than 4,000 disciplined men in his rapid retreat east that day. That retreat continued without a pause until he had put the Euphrates River between him and the dreaded Macedonians. After Issus, the young Macedonian leader gave no evidence of the hysterical reaction that followed the fighting at Granicus. He seemed both tired and thoughtful, and was bothered, besides, by a painful sword wound in his hip, so that he had been helped around and did not mount Bucephalus for a few days. Most military historians have followed a pattern of comment, in pointing out that Darius, what does the Persian of that look like? But Darius is closer, made a final mistake by penning up his much more numerous forces on the narrow front in rough terrain where cavalry could not easily operate and where his superiority in missile fire was largely nullified. This is all true, but Darius could hardly have anticipated that a full-scale battle would take place precisely there. On the shore at Issus, we have some record of the factors influencing his generals. Some 3 days before Issus, a decision was made not to assume the defensive by waiting on the open Syrian plain, but to go to attack. The Persian commanders accomplished the difficult feat of maneuvering a much larger army across the communications of the Macedonians. They were closing rapidly on the Macedonians, where Alexandros turned back sharply to meet them. He caught them and still extended in march column and turned what had been up to then a strategic defeat into a decisive tactical victory. As to the argument that the Persian commanders forfeited their best advantage by leaving an open plain, the Macedonians showed later on Gaugamela what would happen on ground, not only but artificially leveled for cavalry action. When the Macedonians had superiority in discipline, they had overwhelming superiority in command, not only in Alexandros' leadership, but in the quality of the brigade commanders. Alexandros could not have made the difficult move over the shoulders of the hills if Parmenio had not held the left flank together against great pressure. Parmenio could hardly have managed this if the Thessalian horse had not accomplished a minor miracle by fighting a successful defensive action along the open beach. The next day, at the burial of the dead and the selection of new officers, he paraded the forces to music. He included the townspeople of Issus in the solemn thanksgiving by remitting the tribute due from them and not yet paid. A large part of the Persian treasures found at the abandoned camp, some 3,000 talents, he ordered distributed among officers who had distinguished themselves. Discovering that the main Persian baggage train, corpse of servants, and treasure had been left at the base of Damascus, beyond the coast range, he asked Parmenio to go after it at once, taking the Thessalian horse, who had managed to hold the beach that day, thus giving warriors of Thessalia first chance at greater loot, when Parmenio unearthed at Damascus a group of envoys from Greece who had been negotiating with the great king, Alexandros made a point of including them in his gesture of liberation, dismissing the charge of treason laid against them by Parmenio. He found odd reasons for such amnesty. The two agents from Thebes, he said, were guiltless because Thebes itself had been destroyed by the Macedonians, so that in seeking aid from the great king they were acting as patriots. Other agents he dismissed because they had won honor in the Olympic Games. Finding Iphicrates, the son of the great general of mercenaries among the Athenians, he kept the soldier with him as adviser. Even the Spartan agent he kept only under observation. He wanted no more enemies along this coast of Asia, and his policy of sheer generosity, utterly unexpected, after the near disaster at Issus, impressed those suspicious people strongly. Shipbuilders sailed in front from Cyprus to investigate the new state of affairs and offer their services. Keepers of the ancient shrines on the islet of Aratus petitioned him to make sacrifice at their altars, and emissaries of the merchant trading houses of Beirut brought gifts and an invitation to visit their garden city built along the breast of the mighty Lebanon, founded, as they said, by the sea nymph Beroe, or perhaps by the goddess Astarte. Oh. So they thought it was the goddess Astarte, demoness, perhaps. Goetia number 29, 36, according to the Church of Hermeticus. Gohtia, we're saying Greek now, right? Gohtia, who had appeared out of the forest riding a lion. Actually, Beirut is a Semitic name, its meaning the wells. Beirut, okay. It seemed to these Easterners that Alexandros possessed a power which could derive only from what they considered to be gods. Besides, they estimated that he would influence the coast of trade for at least 2 years.